to establish a false ideal, retain control of the world, and block the advance of God's providence. This is the significance of the arising of Hitler, who saw himself in many ways in a position like Jesus. Copies of the Bible in Germany replaced with Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his own biographical, and also his focus upon the expansion of the master race, the Germanic people, and his goal of world conquest. This was Satan's second attempt. Now, God's side should prevail over this unprincipled attempt by fulfilling this worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage. So the second providential cause behind the war was to have people on God's side overcome Jesus' second temptation on the global level, inheriting that foundation. Remember that by overcoming the second temptation in the wilderness, Jesus laid the foundation for multiplication, the second blessing, the restoration of children. Likewise, in the Second World War, God's side had to prevail to fulfill the indemnity condition to restore worldwide God's second blessing. This became the foundation for the Messiah to fulfill the second blessing and also to begin to multiply children spiritually through his public ministry. The third providential cause behind the war was to lay the growth stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. Once again, having overcome Satan's second attempt to retain sovereignty and laid the foundation to restore the three great blessings at the growth stage, now God's providence could advance and the foundation for a Christian, God-centered, democratic world could advance. This took place through the establishment of the United Nations, which restored the failure of the League of Nations. It's an interesting side note that Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was one of the strongest supporters of the United Nations and became one of the early U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations, was the grandson of the very man who had opposed America's involvement in the League of Nations, his grandfather, Henry Cabot Lodge. In addition, the Allies also accomplished what the Allies had failed to do after World War I. They turned toward their vanquished enemies, Germany, Japan, and Italy, and invested in them and raised them into the community of democratic nations, establishing them as some of the strongest allies in the current democratic world. Now let's consider the providential results of the Second World War. The age for building a new heaven and a new earth under the leadership of Christ at the Second Advent had now begun as the ministry began to advance. That's why throughout the world many Christians began receiving revelations concerning the return of Christ, and God's spiritual works began occurring throughout the world. Now let's consider the Third World War. The divine principle was written in the midst of the 20th century. That's when it was first written down. And now, after many years have passed, we can see its prophetic insight. We're going to present what was written down in 1958 in the first volume of the Principle and its discussion of the coming Third World War and the world to follow, to see how powerfully it recognized and revealed the process of God's providence. Is the Third World War inevitable? At the consummation of human history, Satan's side and God's side will struggle, until each one can attain sovereignty over the world. That's their competing desire. This is why the democratic world and the communist world stood confronting each other at the latter part of the 20th century as a result of this providential struggle. Consequently, it became inevitable that there would be wars. First to divide the world and then ultimately unify these two worlds. The First and Second World Wars had the providential purpose of dividing the globe into democratic world and communist worlds. At the close of World War II, the world rapidly divided into two camps, and every nation was either part of one or the other, or a third world nation which was forced to ally with one or the other side. Afterward, another third conflict must take place according to the principle to bring about the unification of these two worlds and the foundation for the kingdom of God. This conflict is the Third World War. Now, from the view of the principle, it was inevitable that that Third World War would take place. However, there were two possible ways it could be fought, and this was discussed in 1958 when the principle was written down. In other words, the providence of God's will to establish a third world conflict was absolute, beyond human influence. But how it was going to take place was depending upon the actions of men, human responsibility. One way to bring Satan's side to surrender is through armed conflict. However, the ideal world can never be built merely by defeating enemies in battle. After such conflict, they must be brought to submission internally through love and service and investment, so that everyone can be reconciled and rejoice sincerely from the bottom of their hearts. After World War I, the democratic world couldn't advance simply by the defeat of the Central Powers. There had to be this condition of rebuilding that would have made it advance. That was the key to the advance of democracy after World War II from the principle's point of view. So, the other way, however, that this war could be fought is a wholly internal and ideological conflict without the outbreak of armed hostilities. By which of these two ways will the Third World War actually be fought? It depends upon the success or failure in carrying out the human portion of responsibility. This, the prediction of the principle at that time. Now, the summary of the providence of the Third World War. The Third World War was to be the final global conflict in the providence of restoration. Now, in fact, even though it was primarily a Cold War, the regime of communism around the world cost more death and bloodshed and human suffering than both World War I and World War II combined. 35 or 40 million died in Russia under Stalin. Perhaps 60 to 100 million died in China under Mao Zedong. The tragedy in Cambodia and elsewhere around the world. However, the second summary of the providence of the Third World War, through this war, God's goal was that the democratic world would bring the communist world to submission and build, therefore, the ideal world. During the Third World War, God's side is to found the perfect Abel-type view of life based upon a new truth, a third reformation, a spiritual renewal in the free and democratic world, and establish the completion stage level of world democracy. So it's not enough that the communist world was overcome and the Cold War was ended. Now, in the free and democratic world, a spiritual renewal is absolutely necessary. Consider the United Nations, which was founded as an instrument to advance the providence of democracy and pave the way for God's kingdom, has become ineffectual as a tool of peacemaking, struggling, racked by scandal, although supporting worthy and humanitarian causes, also dominated by national self-interest and many other problems, and it's been ineffective in expanding the foundation for peacemaking in the world. Meantime, we see the narrow-minded and fundamentalist members of the world's faiths are confronting each other. Terrorism and global conflict for those who want to articulate only their own narrow religious view. This leads some to conclude that there will be an inevitable clash of civilizations. And then look at the free world, the decline of morality, the breakdown of the family, confusion in our value systems, the struggle and difficulty of young people, and all that's taking place. This can only be solved through a new, third, spiritual renewal, religious reformation through the new truth, to strengthen the family, to clarify the foundation of morality, ethics, and value, to lift religious leadership beyond their own narrow sectarian interests and see a global view, the universal values which are being pursued by all humanity, to renew the United Nations. And you will see that those who understand the divine principle and who are working, representing its goals and interests, are doing just that, working for renewal at the United Nations, working for interreligious dialogue and harmony, working to bring peace in the Middle East through reconciliation, dialogue, and understanding, working to rebuild and bring blessing to the family and lift up young people in the world. This is the direction that must be taken now as a result after the Third World Conflict. God's side must then guide all humanity into one unified world. So the providential causes behind this Third World War: first, the war had to take place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage to restore God's three great blessings. At the consummation of human history, there would absolutely emerge an unprincipled world with the pretense of having restored the three great blessings at the third stage level. Satan's third attempt to retain sovereignty. This was the mission of communism in the 20th century, and the significance of the rise of Stalin and his effort to build Soviet imperialism, a Soviet empire, and world communism. By prevailing over the satanic world, God's side is responsible to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage, to restore the world of the three blessings centered upon God. Second, the Third World War has to take place to have people on God's side overcome Jesus' third temptation on the world level. Remember, by overcoming the third temptation in the wilderness, Jesus established the foundation to restore dominion over creation. He resisted Satan's offer for control over the kingdoms of the world, restoring the basis for a godly dominion. Likewise, in the Third World War, God's side must win to restore all humanity's dominion over the entire universe. This will be realized through the sovereignty and success of God's third Adam, the Messiah. Then, thirdly, the Third World War has to take place to lay the completion stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. Satan's three attempts to retain dominion have been vanquished. The foundation for the three blessings and Jesus' three temptations to be restored has been made. Now God can advance his sovereignty and realize the kingdom. God's side must be victorious in this conflict, destroy the communist world, and return all sovereignty to God. The providential results of the Third World War: God intends to restore through indemnity the entire providence, which was prolonged to this third stage, by winning victory in all three of these world conflicts, which belong to the final chapter of providential history. The providence of restoration can be completed only after fallen people restore their heart toward God through God's life-giving word and inherit God's lineage. The victories of God's side in these three world wars will make possible the realization of God's ideal world, for which he has labored with unremitting tears over the centuries of human misery. We have been able to see at the close of the 20th century the end of communism, the foundation for the realization of God's ideal. In our final presentation, we will look at the second coming of the Messiah, the return of Christ, and answer the question, how is God working in our own age and time? Thank you for your kind attention. God bless.